Welcome to a brand new podcast series on coaching tools and approaches, brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Claudia Day, coach and entrepreneur and co-founder of The Growing Coaches. Research shows that certain approaches can be effective. However, it also shows that integrating more than one approach can be even more effective. I will be in conversation with experts and look in more detail at some of these approaches, what the research says, how coaches can apply this in their practice, as well as some live demos to understand better how the approach is put into practice. Our aim in this series is to bring you closer to the research and information on a variety of approaches that you might like to put into practice. Welcome to Rob Willson, who specializes in cognitive behavioral therapy, also author and lecturer on the topic. Rob, it would be great to hear how you got here.
So I've been watching the world of coaching with great interest for a number of years as a therapist. As the stress management consultants seem to fall into the background, the coaches seem to take up the space. And a number of colleagues, people like Wendy Dryden and Michael Neen and so on, close colleagues, have been involved in the world of coaching for a long time. And a while ago, the Association for Coaching asked me to do a session on CBC, on Cognitive Behavioural Coaching, and I rather enjoyed looking at that, and then became involved in doing one or two other sessions for the AC, and then more involved in teaching at Henley Business School, where you and I met, and have written a few chapters on Cognitive Behavioural Coaching subsequently. And I find it a very interesting and emerging field.
So is it safe to say that you're still doing a lot of therapy and some of it also on coaching, applying the coaching, what you know from the therapy side to the coaching?
Well, I think that this is the whole story in a way, which is that, as I see it, there is the cognitive behavioural approach, and then there are different places and different kinds of problems to which that's applied. So I would argue that most therapists, when they're helping their clients to say they've got over their main clinical problem, there's still the issue of getting back to work, dealing with colleagues, dealing with deadlines, and kind of reorienting themselves to that kind of work pressure and establishing good balance in other aspects of life. So I think that the kind of coaching areas have always fallen into the remit of therapists anyway. And I think it's long been an interest of mine to see how the cognitive behavioural approach could be used more in the workplace, because obviously mental health problems are now one of the very biggest reasons for people being off sick from work. We know that happiness and fulfilment at work isn't quite where we'd want it to be. For me, it's really about how can we extend the reach of these tools and techniques and principles that we've got, and hoping that integrating them into the workplace will be a great way of helping people to learn to take care of their thoughts and their beliefs, their behaviours and their emotions, and achieve better mental health. Obviously, in the workplace, that's largely pointed towards things like increased productivity and maybe furthering your career and performing better in different ways. But my big hope is that these are all sympathetic to living in ways which are more mentally healthy.
So increasing performance while also making sure the well-being is there included. So in this journey of seeing how you can apply CBC, cognitive behavioral coaching, to the workplace, what have you found?
Well, the great news is, from the perspective of where CBC comes from, is that it's inherently quite a pragmatic kind of problem-solving kind of approach. So even with people who have relatively, I think that would safe to say some degree of skepticism about small kind of traditional psychotherapy techniques, or even techniques that might seem a bit abstract and disconnected from the real world, like maybe even mindfulness for some people, CBC has this kind of problem-solving, goal-oriented kind of quality to it, and we'll use familiar tools like cost-benefit analysis. We'll use pie charts to help people to look at areas of responsibility. It's quite easy to tailor this approach in a fashion that is more, I think, more acceptable, more familiar to a lot of people that maybe otherwise would be quite sceptical, as I say, about psychological techniques.
So for people in their workplace or who are used to having this analytical side to them, it's an approach that takes this into and uses it for the benefit of looking into thoughts or emotions or behaviors in a way that is helpful for them.
That's very well put.
So I guess it would be, if I'm thinking of integrating several approaches, it could, for someone who is not wanting to engage too much with coaching, it might be a nice way in to the process of coaching.
Yeah, that's often my experience. And we know that people have a lot of sort of stereotypes around the idea of what coaching and therapy might look like. And I think the agenda setting, goal-orienting side of CBC is very much more like we have a very business-like approach, and we always have done, even if you're working in very, in acute clinical settings. I know lots of therapists who'd much prefer to be sitting side by side at a desk or a table with their client than they would be sitting in two chairs in the kind of traditional counselling sort of stance. So we're already in a very business-like approach, and I think that means that we're very much more, we operate in a way which is more familiar and therefore safe feeling for some people.
Makes sense. Can you share with us a bit more about the research that has been done on using these type of approaches?
So this is if you think again about the overall cognitive behavioural tradition, then there is no other school of psychological helping that has anywhere near the quantity of research that the cognitive behavioural approach has. We can say that in every area we've looked, it seems that the cognitive behavioural approach has good efficacy, from stress management problems through to acute psychosis. So it has a very wide reach, and we know that it's helpful for performance anxiety, as I say, things like stress management, some degree of low mood. And so we've now got a very large number of clinical trials. We can infer a great deal of the efficacy and the right techniques to use with different kinds of problems from those clinical trials with more clinical populations and diagnoses. And now there is, over the last 20 years, there's been a growing body of research. You're looking at using CBC more specifically in the workplace, models like SPACE, and we have various other attempts to use CBC in the workplace, and the evidence base is growing. And in some ways, it's still probably at least as good as many other approaches to coaching. But from a therapist perspective, it looks like we're only just beginning to catch up to the massive quantity of data behind the more therapy tradition. And the good news is, though, that it doesn't take a great deal of mental gymnastics to look at some of the research that shows how to work with, say, depression using behavioural activation, and imagine how you could use that to help someone to restructure their time a little better, gradually and steadily, to learn to follow rules like only sort of starting relatively small and making very specific changes. We can use things like what we've learned from working with social anxiety, about self-focused attention and how that interferes with performance. And we can help people then, if they're in meetings or presenting to colleagues, to learn to use what we call field attention more and interrogate the world around them, to help to lift self-consciousness and help the person to feel more comfortable when they're presenting. So all of these things have been well established. There's really good evidence about the efficacy for, say, CBT for depression or CBT for social anxiety, but it's very easy to infer and how we would use some of those techniques in a coaching context.
Thank you for that. So basically, from what I'm understanding, there is a lot of research in therapy, and it's very easy to translate to coaching. There has also been research in coaching, but there's still a lot more to do. And there's a bit of a frustration of there's so much we could do and hasn't been done. So almost like having very keen practitioners and that could do more research. So something to look out for. Thank you. We can look forward to that. There you were describing, of course, some of the things that could be some of the benefits or some of the areas of work where we could use CBC as an approach. If I am someone from the outside who has never seen CBC being applied before, what would I see where I say, oh yeah, that's definitely CBC?
That's going to vary a little bit, of course, from one practitioner to another. But I think in general terms, you'd hope to see someone who is showing great curiosity about how the world works. So we're really interested in helping people to identify their goals and the things they'd like to change about themselves and the way they're performing or responding to challenges or how they're handling various dilemmas. So you'd see a kind of a focus on goal achievement, but that would be true of a great many approaches to coaching. What we'd bring to it would be particularly as an eye for the thoughts that are driving any problematic emotions or are perhaps blocking someone from certain kinds of performance. So sometimes called self-limiting beliefs or performance interfering thoughts. From my perspective, these are all mental events and thoughts. And a cognitive behavioural coach would be curious to try and understand what the client is thinking that's interfering with their ability to function optimally. But further to that, we would wisely think about how those thoughts are being maintained by patterns of behaviour. So if I believe I can't cope with a certain situation, that thought is important and it's something to gather evidence for and maybe test out. But the coach's curiosity is also, what action is that person taking that's maintaining that sense of not being able to cope, for example? Are they avoiding? Are they over-preparing? Are they overthinking things? So the cognitive behavioural coach will be trying to ferret out important thoughts and cognitions. They'll be trying to understand how those beliefs and thoughts are being maintained. And then hopefully they'll be working to help the client consider both the evidence for and against old and unhelpful thoughts, but also trying to help the client to generate more helpful alternatives and looking for the evidence for and against those helpful alternatives too. And typically, the session is going to be moving towards some kind of homework task, which is another kind of really key feature. And that very often is going to be some form of behavioural change, maybe something that we would think of as a behavioural experiment where the person goes to try and test out their particular thought or prediction in some way. And I think the other thing you probably notice using, if you were observing a cognitive behavioural coaching session in action, you'd hope that you'd see quite a lot of questions being asked, what we call Socratic questions. And again, these don't belong to CBC, but they are very much seen as part of the way we would approach things within CBC. So asking questions to elicit certain thoughts, asking questions to evaluate and consider the evidence for and against certain thoughts or how helpful these thoughts are, asking questions to try and generate alternatives, asking questions to consider these alternatives, how helpful might they be, what's the evidence to support them, questions like how can we find out a bit more, driving towards some behaviours. So the idea is that the cognitive behavioural coach is trying to help the client's brain to figure things out and support and guide, use what we call guided discovery. So it's going to be full of curiosity, lots and lots of questions, maybe the odd explanation of how we think things work and if the client needs to be shown how to use a particular tool, but very much driving towards, okay, what are our action points going to be for the next few days or next couple of weeks or something, and how will we find out a bit more about the way this problem works?
Perfect. So lots of curiosity, guided discovery, and action points for the client to go and test them.
Absolutely.
If we take the topic of self-focus attention,
yes,
which was one that somehow came to me, and we think of all of this, could you give the audience a bit more of an idea of what they would see when a coach is coaching on this topic?
Yeah. So imagine the person feels a little anxious in meetings and doesn't like to speak up, or the person finds it quite challenging if they're having to give a presentation it could be in front of colleagues or more formally to do some training or something. One of the things we'd be interested in is, of course, the thoughts and if there's any mind reading and things that are going on. But we might ask about where's your attention focused as you're talking or as you're thinking about asking a question? Where's the focus of your attention? Are you focused externally and all around you, or do you find that your attention's focused internally. And so sometimes you might ask, if you think of your total amount of attention as 100%, how much of your attention is focused on you and how much of your attention is focused on the room that you're in, the other people in the room, and so on. And so you're kind of looking to see whether the person has large quantities of self-focused attention. And if we're honest, that's probably, you could infer that if the person has a kind of history of feeling quite anxious in performance or social situations of different kinds, it's a reasonable guess that they're likely to have some level of self-consciousness. But we wouldn't just assume it. But one of the things that happens we're advantaged of in CBC is we do have quite a lot of empirical data showing us how various problems work. So we kind of know what to look for because the evidence base tells us that certain things are quite important. So as I say, in some kind of social anxieties or performance anxieties, we know that self-consciousness is often a thing. So we'd inquire about it. And then we might ask a bit more about, how do you think that's affecting you? How does that play out? So we might be really curious about, what do you think the effect is? Because what we know is that the more self-conscious people feel, or rather the more their attention's focused upon themselves, the more self-conscious they feel. And the more self-conscious we feel, the more likely you are to think that people are thinking critically of you. So it has quite a paralysing effect of sort of then jacking your anxiety up. And of course, what can then happen is that as you feel a bit more stressed, you might worry that your voice is going to sound trembly if you speak up or ask a question or make a point in the meeting. You might worry that you're going to look hot and sweaty, or red in the face or something if you're presenting. And of course, as you become more and more self-conscious and worried about these phenomena, you get caught in this vicious cycle. So something that we'll do in coaching is to map those processes out, try and do a series of little vicious circles to try and help the person to understand not only that they're focusing their attention on themselves, but the effects of it, so that we can really get a sense of, okay, maybe I understand a bit more about what's happening. And then it becomes relatively logical to then have a conversation about, so what do you think we should try and do about that? And then if we wanted to go ahead and do some more about that, we might then suggest that we try out some experiments in some social situations or performance situations. And what is it like if you focus your attention really closely on how you feel you're coming across, how red you might feel you look, how you feel your voice is sounding, that kind of thing, versus really trying to drill your attention into the world around you and interrogating the sights and the sounds and the smells and so on into the world around you. And that, for some people, might be enough to get them to see that that's a good important path to go down. We can add to this by encouraging people to go out and do some deliberate practice in refocusing their attentions. And this is a little bit like mindfulness training, where we'll ask people to go away and just do 10 minutes a day of deliberately focusing their attention on the ground underneath their feet, the wind against their skin, the things they can see, the things they can smell, the things they can hear, and spending about 2 minutes per sense on a 10-minute walk. And the idea is there that what we're doing is we're trying to help the person to strengthen their kind of, if you like, their attentional focusing muscles. We're trying to improve the person's sense of control over the focus of their attention. And I've always found this rather interesting, is it kind of brings us full circle to some of the same principles that you use in sports psychology, which takes us right back to, if you like, to kind of coaching's roots, that where we're the trainers of helping people to get their kind of mental fitness up and becoming more flexible. And so the hope is that by then helping the person to get a real sense of how to master the focus of their attention, they can then bring that skill. So it's like doing your physiotherapy at home and then using that when you're playing a match or something. You've done the attention training. You've then built that skill up a bit. And then when you're in that performance situation, you can find that, and it really does work this, you find that you just be in the room much more than feeling how you're coming across. And it is a big relief. It gives you a lot less to think about.
In terms of course, there's a lot of, part of it happens in the session of trying to understand what is happening with the person. But then a lot of it also happens outside the session, where they're trying these things out and seeing what works and how it is different, or being more aware of their thoughts.
Absolutely.
How easy is it to get people to actually work in between sessions?
Well, that is a really, really key question. And I think it is the same dilemma as physiotherapists and personal trainers have. it's all very well people doing it in the session. It's a follow through in the real world that makes, that is the big key, the big lever. And we certainly know from some of the outcome research that homework compliance, so to speak, people following through on their out of session tasks, is probably the biggest predictor in outcome. What makes the most difference, in my experience, and some of the research also shows this, that if the person fully understands what the purpose of the assignment is. So it takes you right back to doing what we would call formulating or conceptualizing, so that the person understands the way we've tried to define their dilemma or define their problem. And therefore so if you understand, say, that certain thoughts are key in procrastinating, or that certain habits that you've got into are key for that procrastinating, if you understand that jumping to certain conclusions are key in you feeling quite irritated and angry about your colleagues, say, if you understand the pattern of putting things off and the strain that places upon you, or the pattern of testing people out a little bit in your colleagual relationships just to see whether they really care or they're really interested. If you understand the mechanisms and the thoughts that are connected to them and how those are working, then the job of the coach is to make sure that the client is with them in these understandings. And so once you've built a good understanding of the problem, and then you've together figured out, therefore, the solution tends to be more logical and makes more sense. Once we've established those parts of the puzzle, then agreeing some form of task or practice or experiment to try these things out, you're going to get a much greater buy-in if the person's been with you all along, from the understanding the problem through to figuring out the solution, and then the homework task or the assignment to do outside of the session. So it really is about making sure that we stay collaborative, and our conversation is not about being authoritative, but it's about running alongside your client and really trying to just check in about your understanding, and really making sure that this is a shared understanding of a dilemma you're sort of standing side by side together looking at, and therefore the solution hopefully makes a great deal more sense. That being said, people oftentimes still forget what they're going to do, or they lose their nerve a little bit. So part of good coaching to be to make sure we've got kind of the assignment written down. Maybe we've encouraged the client to record the session so they've got something to refer back to. And hopefully you try and look ahead and anticipate what some of the obstacles to the assignment might be. But as Beck always said, the founding father of cognitive therapy, Aaron Beck, he said that even if people don't do their homework, that's still grist for the mill. So you'll still learn, even if the person was really up for carrying out a particular behavioural assignment, and then it was too difficult, they lost their nerve, they became confused, it didn't quite go as expected, then you're bringing that back to the next session, and our job is to understand, okay, well, what when you put it off or you avoided it, kind of what went through your mind, and trying to make sense of any obstacles or trip ups along the way. So we just see that's part of the process. So do what you can to increase the outcome, and maybe even a bit of mental rehearsal and things can be useful. But we don't see it as a disaster if the homework task doesn't quite play out. We see it as being, that's how we're going to learn a little bit more about how the problem works and how our client works.
So having skill, so thank you for describing that, the skill that the coach needs within the session to understand what's happening and be curious and have this guided discovery, but then within the action points, how it's a collaborative and a work that is done together, and how if it's not done, it's actually also information by itself and something to work on the next session. And I loved also the mental rehearsal, because of them trying it out on the session before leaving. Sounds great. In terms of the closest cousins, who would you say are the closest cousins to CBC?
Well, that's an interesting question, because it sort of depends on how you define your CBC. We would think about the cognitive behavioural approach as being this enormous umbrella, it's a school of psychological approaches. So you could think of acceptance and commitment therapy as being a close cousin of CBC, or you could think of it as part of the CBC tradition. because we now have in CBC, we have different waves. We have the first wave, which was more traditional behavioural therapy, which largely involved a lot of focus on things like facing your fears and restructuring your time and things, and as the name suggests, a more behavioural approach. Then we have the kind of what we call second wave, which is where Beck came along and added his cognitive therapy and also a lot of input from Albert Ellis's rational motor behaviour therapy, which really brought out how both of those approaches helped to bring to light the relevance of thoughts in emotional problems. And then the third wave is acceptance, commitment therapy and mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and those kinds of things, which are more about the relationship you have with your thoughts, but isn't necessarily about changing them per se, maybe more mindful detachment and acceptance commitment therapy is very much about driving towards following your values and trying to defuse from your thoughts. So those are close cousins, as is compassion-focused therapy is a close cousin, but they're also they're very much part of the family.
Yeah, it sounds like a big family. And if you think of the parents, who would the parents be?
So the parents are really some of the very founding fathers of clinical psychology, really, of counselling psychology. We're talking, the Watsons, the Skinners, the Banduras, as well as the Albert Ellises and the Aaron Becks. So the principles of classical conditioning and operant conditioning and social learning theory, those are all very important to the development of CBT and CBT. And Albert Ellis, who invented rational motor behaviour therapy, was very interested in not only the kind of the behaviour therapy research that was going on, things like systematic desensitization that was happening in the 50s. I guess he was also influenced, as is much of the cognitive behavioural tradition, in much older parental figures like the Stoics, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, and if you look at some of the more philosophical sides of this approach, you can see very clearly it's been influenced somewhat by approaches like Zen Buddhism. There's a bit of that DNA in our CBC mongrel, but a lot of influence from the Stoics as well.
Can you tell the audience a bit more, as in how those very far back philosophical had an impact on CBC? I mean, how you still applied and when you think of them?
So the Stoics had a very strong perspective that it wasn't really what happened to us that affects how we feel, it's the way we think about it. That perspective, if you like, still runs through the tradition. It is, in a way, we've done nothing clever here. We've just taken a very old idea and expanded and developed it somewhat. So I think it was Epictetus that said, men are not affected by things, but the view that they take of things. So the idea is that, and certainly that was where Albert Ellis was a consumer of philosophy. And he was just really, really curious because he was very disillusioned by the efficacy of the psychodynamic approaches that he was trained in. So that led him to be much more interested about he was an avid reader of philosophy since he was quite a young person. So he's very curious what of these ideas could he use to develop an alternative approach to psychotherapy. Whereas Beck's approach arrived at a similar destination, but his was much more about looking for certain psychodynamic processes in depression, which he couldn't find, but instead noticed there's lots and lots of negative thinking in depression. So he then thought, well, I wonder what happens if we change some of that negative thinking. So they both arrived at this point. Arguably, Al got there a little bit earlier than Beck, but yeah, they both arrived at this point of thinking that, okay, reasoning, thinking, our own personal philosophy is really at the key of how we make sense of the world, and therefore that view of the world, the meaning that we have about ourselves, the world and other people, what affects how we feel about it. And how we feel about it then has a big impact on how we behave about it.
From what you described, there is a lot of value on, of course, the person understanding that their thoughts impact their behaviors and their emotions, and for them also to carry out the experimentation in between sessions. So how do you manage contracting? How much information do you give the coachee during your contracting, and how do you go about explaining these concepts?
So it's always been embedded in the tradition that this is a very explicit kind of approach. So I like to encourage people to do a little bit of reading around the cognitive behavioural approach before they start a session. And there's various self-help texts that I quite like people to look at. But obviously, these days, there's plenty of websites that people can go have a look at too. But one of the easiest things to do is to use what we call the hot cross bun model of the cognitive behavioural approach, which you can use in therapy and you can use in coaching. It's extremely flexible because it's a 5 systems model, helping people to understand that our perspective on how human beings work is that our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions and our physiological responses are all complexly interacting. And all of these, of course, take place in the environment, which is a sort of 5th side of the model. And that then what we'll be looking to do in coaching is to try and understand where there might be opportunity for change or room for improvement, so to speak, in any parts of these systems. And so what we're going to try and do is try and make sense of any dilemma or problem that you've got in terms of trying to break it down a bit into these different systems, like what goes through your mind, what kind of emotions do you experience, how do you tend to behave, or does it have any impact on your sleep, your appetite, your heart rate, your energy levels. And then we're going to try and test out to see if we make what we think are going to be helpful changes in any parts of this system. We'll see whether that does in fact turn out to be more beneficial. So we're going to test some changes in differences in the way you think, differences in the way you behave. We might even want to look at very simple things like how regularly the person gets up in the morning and whether their sleep cycle is in sync with the sun, or how regularly they're eating, even at that kind of more physiological level, because we can think about those as sort of half behaviour, half biology, if you like. So just showing someone the hot cross bun as a model, this 5 systems, what we call the hot cross bun model, the 5 systems approach, is a great way of showing someone this is how we understand the world. This is what cognitive behavioural coaching kind of brings to coaching dilemmas, and to check it, does this seem like a reasonable way of trying to make sense, a bit more sense of what's going on, and see if we can break things down and then try and find some chances to make a bit of a difference.
So after I start with an individual working with them on a specific issue, it sounds like an approach where you need more sessions to be able to achieve the desired results. So what does research say in terms of number of sessions and how, on average, how many sessions does an individual need?
So this is a really, really interesting area, and something that my friend and colleague Wendy Dryden is currently saying quite a lot of interesting things about with his one at a time approach to coaching and therapy, which is to try and encourage us to stop thinking about a sequence of sessions, remembering that the most common number of sessions that people will have is a single session. So it's a chewy area, this. There is something to be said that you want to try and, if you imagine you might only have one session, you would want to make sure that you're going to share some new insights into at least understanding perhaps that how you feel and respond behaviourally is affected by how you think, and maybe trying to help the person understand that there's potential for changing that outlook, and to help support that change of that outlook you might want to change some behaviours to back that up. And a lot of people are very helped by just having that particular insight and maybe having one area to test that perspective out, and it then can open up a lot of doors to a fresh way of kind of keying into your emotional system. And even in a very serious, heavy performance-related coaching session, the person in front of you still has an emotional system, and that will be having quite a big role to play in how they're performing. The kind of, on the one hand, you're wanting to try and make sure that with each session, ideally you're leaving the person with something useful, a new concept or a plan of action of something to try out. Assuming, though, that most clients are going to come back for a series of sessions, you're typically, I think, looking as a minimum of probably about half a dozen, on average probably about 10 to 12 coaching sessions we would think. We could do with a bit more research because, again, we're somewhat inferring some of this from the therapy side of this approach. But nevertheless, even for someone to change their thoughts, behaviours that have been fairly well entrenched in a workplace context, they're still going to require often a bit of persistence and practice.
Makes sense.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of the chat with Rob Willson. In today's episode, we talked about the progression of this approach from therapy and some of the key components of CBC. Stay tuned for part 2 of the chat. It includes a live demo with some of the techniques used in CBC. Thank you for listening to another episode by the Association for Coaching. I have been Claudia Day. We hope this episode offers you some new insight and inspiration. For 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or explore our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. There, you can keep up to date with our latest episodes, enjoy the wealth of digital learning offerings, and gain insights from our Coaching Perspectives magazine.